For our first tutorial, we are going to make a very simple blue sky with light clouds. So I'm going to be using some Payne's Gray and Ultramarine Blue. For the Payne's Gray, we are going to water it down quite a bit. We don't want to have too much gray in the clouds, but we're going to use a bit of the watered down Payne's Gray to give us a bit of definition and a bit of separation in between the clouds. So as you can see here, it's just going to be a very, very, very light wash of that Payne's Gray. If you don't have Payne's Gray, you can take a little bit of watered down black, add a tiny bit of blue to brighten it up a bit, and water that down. For the ultramarine blue, we are going to be using this for the sky. So we are going to be using different saturation levels. We're going to start really, really light, pretty watered down, and then slowly darken it up. One of the techniques that we will be using for this particular sky painting is called lifting. So we're going to take a paper towel and bunch it up in your hands, and while the paint is still wet on the paper, you just press it down and it will lift some of that paint up. So you can ball up your paper towel in different ways to get different textures and to get different variety of lifting off of your paper, and you're going to see a little bit more of that later. So as you can see here, I could not find my painter's tape for the life of me, so I just used regular Scotch tape. What I did was I put the Scotch tape on my jeans and peeled it up so I can get some fuzz so that it wouldn't stick to my paper and rip it. So if you're going to use Scotch tape, just kind of be careful, because if you dry your piece with a hair dryer, it will start to lift the edges. And you'll see that happens with my piece, but it's not a big deal for me. Okay, step one. I'm going to take a flat brush and I am going to completely water down my paper. So wet it, let the water soak in. One other little thing that I wanted to tell you while you see me wetting my paper is that for this technique, I've always found it best to use 100% cotton watercolor paper because it stays wet longer. So for this one and for the next one, I highly recommend 100% watercolor paper, 100% cotton watercolor paper. Okay, back to the tutorial. So I'm going to take some ultramarine blue. The one I have is Ultra Finest by Schmincke. Any ultramarine blue will do. I'm adding some to my plate. As you can see, I'm not going to use it directly from the pan that's how I usually paint. I usually paint directly from the pan. But since I want to start building up the layers in my sky, I am actually going to use it from my plate. And it's just a regular ceramic plate or porcelain plate. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to lay a thin layer of the ultramarine blue across the entire page. I am going to be focusing a lot of the color along the left hand side of the paper. So you're going to see that I'm always going to start on the left and I'm going to drag the color down. I just want it to be just a tiny bit lighter on the right hand side of the paper. I am going to continue adding more layers of the ultramarine blue. Again, starting at the left and working my way to the right so that I have more color deposit on the left hand side. You can make this as dark or as light as you want. You can stop here if you like. The clouds will still show through because you'll be able to lift some of that paint up. I wanted mine a little darker, so I'm just going to keep adding a couple of layers until it gets to right where I want it. But again, you can add as many or as few layers as you would like. So this is about as dark as I want it for now. You'll see that I add a little bit more color later, but for now this is good. I am going to ball up a paper towel and I'm going to start lifting some of that color up. As you'll see, I did not dry the paper. In order for this to work more effectively, the paper has to be wet. So I'm going to start lifting some of that color with gentle motions. When your paper towel gets saturated with color, just find a new piece. And if you see, the more you lift up in the same spot, or the more you touch the paper towel to the same spot, the more color it lifts up. And you can absolutely use this to your advantage. If you do soft, gentle patting on the paper, you'll get a soft, gentle lift of color. If you go a little bit more aggressively, a little firmer, then you'll get more color lifted from the paper. And again, if you go over the same areas more than once, you'll get more color lifted from that paper. So use it to your advantage. Use those techniques to make fluffier clouds in the background and a little bit more defined clouds in the foreground. So in the foreground, lift a little bit more than you would for the background clouds. Once you are satisfied with the amount of lifting that you have done, dry your paper or make sure it's dry before moving on to the next step. For this next step, I'm going to use a very, very, very light layer of water. We don't want the paint to start moving everywhere, or the paints that's already on the paper. We don't want that to start moving everywhere. So a very light layer of color. Use a soft hand so that you're not dragging all of the work that you put into it. You're not dragging all of that paint out. Now this is where the Payne's gray comes in. We're going to water it down as much as possible. Don't have too much water in your brush when you do this, because the more water that's on your brush, the more that paint is going to spread, and we don't want it to spread too much. So go in with a fairly damp brush, but not too much water. And we are going to start tapping in some paints just under the very tops of the clouds. We don't want to add it all the way to the top because we want some definition in between the clouds. So add a bit of that Payne's gray here and there, just a tiny bit, not too much. We don't want the clouds to be too dark. Once you are satisfied with the amount of gray that you have on your paper, then move on to the next step. So the paper is still going to be fairly wet, and I am going to start deepening the sky just a little bit, just a little bit. So the paper should be a little bit wet. If it's not, this is the time that you should go ahead and wet it and alternate between the blue and just a little bit of water in order to wet the very top of the sky. Don't go over the clouds because it's going to mix everything in together. But if you wanted to deepen up the sky a little bit, now's your chance to do that. So that's what I'm doing. I'm adding a bit more color on the left hand side of the paper, dragging it towards the right, but I'm using a very, very gentle hand because I don't want to disturb the layers underneath. At this point, I also want to add a little bit of definition in between the clouds and towards the bottom of the paper. So I'm going to add a little tiny bit more blue along the bottom, and I'm going to water that down, adding a little bit of blue in between some of the clouds just to show a little bit of separation. And again, I'm adding water at the end, so I'm adding the tiniest bit of blue. I'm going to go back in with my paper towel, and I'm going to add just a few more fluffy clouds in the background. Again, my paper is still fairly wet, and it's fairly wet because it's cotton paper, so that takes a lot longer to dry than non-cotton paper. So I'm just adding in the tiniest fluffs of clouds in the background and along the bottom of the paper. If you want your clouds to remain fluffy and cool like this, then you don't have to do this next part. But if you want a little bit more definitions along the tops of the clouds, grab a little bit of white. In my case, I used Copic Opaque white. You can add some gouache, you can add some watercolor, and just add the very tiniest amount to some of the tips or the very tops of the clouds. You don't want to add too many. Not every single cloud has a very stark edge. Some of them are very soft and billowy. So I'm going to add it for just a few. And you'll see that in some of the areas where I add the white, I water it down quite a bit. And in other areas, I just let the white be stark. So, you know, however you're envisioning your cloud structure to be, then that's kind of how you translate it on the paper. You can also grab a picture of a photograph of a nice blue cloudy sky and kind of mimic what you see using these techniques. Now using this same small brush, and this is a liner brush from Arteza, I'm going to go in and add a little bit of definition in between the clouds. So again, my paper is still very wet, so I'm able to do this without having any hard water lines. So I'm adding just the tiniest bit of definition, some of that blue from the background coming through and I'm using a very watered down ultramarine. Um, I am also adding a bit of definition to some of the clouds on top. And some of the clouds where I added the Copic Opaque white to the tips, I am really separating that from the background by adding a little bit of a darker blue around the edges, so around the back. And again, if you wanted to leave your sky nice and soft and billowy, then you don't have to do this part. Once you are satisfied with the final look of your clouds, um, make sure that your paper is dry, or as I do, dry your paper with a heat gun, and you are done. Your clouds are complete. For the next sky painting, I'm going to be painting a fiery sky, so like a sunset. And I am going to be using heliconia, poppy, and a tiny bit of indigo. Again, we are going to start by wetting our paper with a flat brush. make sure that it is thoroughly wet and the paint has soaked in before starting on this piece. We are going to be working in a couple of layers, and the last layer we're going to be working on is going to be worked on a dry paper. So I'm going to start with Poppy, and I am going to grab a generous amount of that, and I'm not watering that one down too much because I want these to be bright, vivid skies. Picking up some hair on my paper, but I am going to start by adding in some broad strokes along the bottom, and then using the very tip of my brush, I'm going to add a few strokes here and there, working my way up. Next, I am going to do the same thing with heliconia, and again, using the tip of your brush, fill in any of those empty spaces in between the white paper and the poppy. And as you can see here, I dip into my pan of paint quite a bit because I don't want this too watered down. I want to make this as bright and as vivid as possible. So you're going to see throughout this painting that I'm going to be dipping my brush inside of the pan and adding some more color to my plate. So the top of the piece is going to be mainly heliconia and the bottom of the piece is going to be mainly poppy. And then the middle is going to be a little bit of a combination between the two. After I lay down that initial wash of color, I am going to switch to a smaller round brush so that I could get a bit more definition. The key to this is to not have too much water on your brush. Remember that when you add too much water on your brush, it disperses the paint quite a bit. So you want your brush to have to be like a little damp, but not too wet. The paper is wet enough. We don't need to keep adding more water for this piece. The more water we add, the less vibrant it's going to be. You see here, I'm going to do a little bit of a mix between the yellow and the orange, and I am going to add that with the very tip of my brush to the bottom of the page, just to kind of merge the two colors a little together. And I'm going to go in and add a bit more of the yellow to the top of the sky because I have lost some of that. And again, I'm just going to keep going over and over some of the areas that are beginning to dry or to lighten a bit, and I am going to make them more vibrant. So keep going over them as much as necessary so that you can achieve the vibrance that you want. Once I am satisfied with how this looks, I'm going to go in and add a bit of indigo. For this, it is imperative that you do not have a wet brush. So take a paper towel and dry some of or take some of that water off before you dip into the indigo, because we do not want this indigo to spread like wildfire all over the page. So I'm just going to add a tiny amount, just a little, 2 or 3 little streaks along the right hand side, and right over that I'm going to take some of my orange and I'm going to go right over it. Now the key to not making this a muddy mess is just to go over it a tiny little bit, just a tiny bit, and don't drag the color all over the sky. Don't drag that blue and orange mix all over the sky. Keep it where it is. When you see that you start dragging more of the blue out or more of the indigo out, clean your brush off, go back in with the orange, and continue. We want to keep the indigo where it is. We don't want it to move too much, but we want to not make it so dark, so we're going to go over it with just a little bit of the orange. Finally, I'm going to add just a couple of very light streaks towards the middle of the page. Don't go too crazy on this. We want to keep as much of that color or of the indigo color on top as possible. And again, I'm going in with the orange to deepen and brighten those colors. Once you are satisfied with it, make sure your paper is 100% completely dry before moving on. So for this last layer of paint, we are not going to pre-wet the paper. We are going wet on dry so that the colors remain as vibrant as possible. I'm going to go in with some of the heliconia, so some of the orange, and then I am going to throw in some black and some indigo. And I'm going to go in with the indigo in the same places where the indigo was before. So because the paper is dry, we're not working wet on wet, the color is mainly going to stay where you put it. And that's kind of what we're looking for here. We don't want the color to move too much. We're done with the underpainting. And right now we are just adding in the details. So we're going to alternate between the orange, between the yellow, between the indigo, and we're adding in that color where you see it on the underpainting. When you go in with the indigo, remember, not too much water on your brush. And when you see that color start to drag away from where you laid it, it's time for you to wash your brush off, add more orange, and keep going down. We don't want that indigo to move too much. We want to soften it. We want to soften the edges, but we don't want it moving and muddying up your piece. Okay, so we're just going to continue now down with the orange, with the yellow, and we are going to work our way down the paper, adding in stripes of those different colors. You'll see here that I feel like there was an unbalance with the indigo, so I'm adding a tiny bit more on the opposite end of the paper, so on the left hand of the paper, and I am putting a little bit of orange over it to mix it in and to soften those edges. So if you feel like you need to add any last minute details, now is the time. If you feel like you need to darken any part of it, now is the time. Finally, for our third sky, I'm going to be using only two colors. I am going to be using Bright Clear Violet and Helios Purple by Sennelier. These two colors blend really well together. Um, so that's why I chose them. So choose two colors that just blend really well together. A purple and a pink, or a blue and a purple, just two colors that work well together. Again, for this sky, we are going to start with watering down our paper. So we're going to be working wet on wet. Using that same flat brush, I am going to go in with my purple and I'm going to add it to the top. So this is another one where I'm going to be building the color up because I want the sky to be fairly deep. But I am going to take it slow and I'm going to slowly build that color up. After I went about halfway down the page, I'm going to go in and add the pinkish purple towards the bottom. I'm going to switch to a round brush now. And again, I switch to a round brush so that I'm able to deposit a bit more paint. You'll see at times I'm working straight from the pan. Other times I'm adding more paint to the plate. Either one works fine. I just want this color to be nice and saturated. So along the top, I'm adding a nice heavy concentration of the purple. And then starting from the bottom up, I'm adding in a nice high concentration of that purple pink until we reach the middle. So one of the techniques that I use when I'm blending two colors is to basically blend the two colors. So if I have a color on top and a color on bottom, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the bottom and blend all the way up to the top and then blend all the way back to the bottom without picking up my brush. So I'm going to load my brush with the pink. I'm going to work my way up and then work my way down. And then I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to load my brush with that purple and I'm going to paint all the way to the bottom. Okay, try not to lift up your brush. You want to do this all in one stroke. So what happens is that yes, you will have a little bit of that purple deposited into the pink, and yes, you will have a little bit of that pink deposited into the purple, but you will get a more seamless blend this way. So if you want a nice, smooth, cloudless sky, this is the perfect technique. You can stop here, dry your paper, and continue as planned. You can draw a foreground, you can do whatever you want. So if you want a nice, seamless, no cloud, smooth sky, then stop here. If we want to add a little bit of clouds to this, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick up some of that purple. And as you saw here, what I did was with my paper towel, I tapped my brush on the paper towel, but not the tip, just along the bristles, the long ends of the bristles, and that's going to suck up some of that water while leaving a lot of the paint on the tip of the brush. Okay, and that's one of the techniques you use when you don't want to have too much water on your brush. So I'm going to use the darkest color, in my case is the purple, and I'm going to tap in some clouds. And I'm going to bring those clouds down to along the middle of the page or of the paper, and a little bit darker on top than in the middle of the paper. So I'm just going in and tapping them in, tapping that dark color in. Once I'm satisfied with those clouds, I am going to just dry off my brush and blend it in just a little. If you're happy with the way your clouds look, you don't need to do this part. I like to do it because sometimes my paint just spreads out too much and I don't want that to happen. So I am smoothing out just a little bit of the edges and I'm adding in a little bit of darker color along the very tops of the clouds. Once I am satisfied with that, I'm going to go in and I'm going to blend in a little bit of the bottom of the clouds. And the reason I'm doing this is because my floor is somehow angled. And anytime I paint on my desk, the paint runs down the paper, no matter how hard I try to avoid that. But I've noticed that it's just because my floor is a little slanted. So I am blending that in so that the clouds don't run down. If you have a straight floor, then you don't need to do this. Finally, not finally, the next thing that I'm going to do after just blending out a little of the bottom of the edges, so it doesn't look like the clouds are running off my paper, is I'm going to add a little bit of the pinkish purple, the Helios purple, to tie it all in together, so to the bottom of the clouds. I am going to tap in that color, starting somewhere along the middle or the bottom half of the clouds. Just add in a tiny bit of your second color to tie it all in together. After adding in that second color, I'm going to go in and I'm going to blend it a little, just a little, not too much. Don't go too crazy. I'm just blending in the edges of it just a little so that it looks a little bit more natural and it doesn't look like two separate clouds. And then I am going to finish off by again blending the bottom because it was running down my paper. You don't need to do this part. But I am going to add some clouds along the bottom because after I stood up and looked at it, it kind of looked a little uneven. So I always recommend that once you're painting a piece, get a different perspective of it. So stand up, look over it, or hold the piece in front of you so you can get a different perspective on your piece and you'll see what's missing. So I'm adding it a bit of that clouds, and this time I'm starting with pink. You can continue with the purple. I'm starting in with the pink and I'm adding in the pink, and over that I'll add just the tiniest bit of the purple. I don't want the bottom to be too dark, so I'm going to add in a lighter layer of that purple along the bottom. And with that, we are done with our first three how to paint sky tutorials. I will bring in a couple more later on down the road. So I will see you in the next tutorial. Bye.